She had made a promise to herself, the way some people make lists, carefully, with margins and margins of thought, vowing that the gift of herself, of any first true surrender, would be given only to the man whose eyes made her feel seen in a way that mattered. It was more than a pledge about bodies. It was a promise about dignity, trust, and a slow sort of devotion she believed was worth the waiting. She carried that promise like a compass. She called it saving herself, and it shaped everything she was. The choices she made, the borders she drew, the small, steady faith she kept in the idea that some meetings were meant to be holy by their tenderness. She never imagined the man who would steal her heart worked in the same glass tower she passed every morning, or that the hand that slipped across her palm under a stranger's mask would be the hand that signed memos and commanded conference rooms from the 25th floor. Emily Morrison smoothed the crease of her skirt as she waited for the elevator, watching the building's reflection catch the dawn like a promise that was always slightly out of focus. Pierce Industries rose like an answer, polished, deliberate, more myth than company to most people. To her, it was a place where she built herself one precise minute at a time. At 24, executive assistant to a man whose name was on the top line of every newswire, she had carved a life that balanced steadiness and ambition. She loved the work. She loved the order of calendars and the way a well-executed meeting felt like choreography. She loved, too, the internal rule that had become a part of her posture. She would save the heart-altering things for someone worthy. From somewhere inside the lobby, the concierge's voice called out the day's greeting. Susan, the receptionist who ran Pierce's nervous center like a benevolent machine, waved at Emily and handed her the mail she'd sorted. "You okay?" Susan asked with a half-smile and an eyebrow that said, "I've been in the same office long enough to know when someone's carrying too many private storms." "Fine," Emily lied smoothly, the kind of small lie that's more of a breathing technique than deception. "Just a lot on my desk today." "Don't let the board see you sweat," Susan said, and then, more softly, "or the boss. He notices things." The name landed with its usual weight. Jackson Pierce was a presence before he entered a room. Rumors about his work ethic, his uncompromising decisions, the way he'd rebuilt his company into something sharp and inevitable. There were glossy features on him in magazines, photographs taken from angles that made him look like an idea rather than a person, and there were passages of rumor about which women had sat at particular tables at particular parties. For Emily, Jackson had always been a man at a distance, an executive silhouette moving behind a frosted glass door. He was her employer, unapproachable in the way high mountains are unapproachable, beautiful to imagine, dangerous to traverse. She had rules. She'd written them down once in a late-night journal while a storm hammered at her apartment window. No dating at the office, no confusing professional obligations with personal chance, no giving away parts of herself that she'd meant to hold sacred. Those rules had less to do with fear and more to do with clarity. She wanted to know with clean light what part of her was being chosen when choices were finally made. Still, rules do not account for chemistry. They do not account for small, unseizable moments, the flash of a smile that lingers beyond what duty allows, the way a look can find the private corner of you where the rest of the world is muffled. In the elevator, she thought of the times his shadow paused in the hallway when she passed, the way his voice softened when he asked for a briefing. He was never cruel, never intrusive. He carried a guarded kindness that sometimes brushed the edges of her control. That was all it was, a brush. She kept the distance because she had decided, deliberately, that some things were not for the office. It was Rachel who pushed at that boundary, like wind against a weathered fence. Tonight, Rachel's text arrived over lunch like an invitation to rebellion. "You're coming to the Merriweather Gala with me, no excuses." The Merriweather was the sort of society event that merit and money attended in equal measure, all silk and perfume and people who acted like they'd been carved from marble. Rachel, who loved the life-editing power of a good dress and a glass of champagne, had promised Emily this was not a mic listing. "You'll have fun," she had said, with the kind of certainty that convinced people to do things they later described as inevitable. "And if you bump into someone interesting, well, what's the harm?" For Emily, the harm was simple and practical. The rules she had kept formed a kind of armature that held her. To go to the gala meant stepping into a world where identity was optional, where masks invited anonymity and possibility. She told herself she would enjoy the night as Emily, as a woman who could laugh at things that were not romantic destiny. She would not be reckless. She would not confuse attraction with surrender.
She bought a mask that hid the top of her face but let her smile keep its shape. She wore a dress that felt like the best version of modesty and allure, a fabric that moved in ways that felt respectful to the promise she had made herself. When she stood in Rachel's living room, the city stretched behind them like a bedtime story. They pinned on their masks and called it a small ceremony. The gala was a room designed to make people feel like stars and shadows at once. Crystal chandeliers spilled liquid light across tables. A string quartet played a melody that made the air taste of old postcards.
Emily floated through it like someone testing the surface of another country. People she'd known from meetings, people whose faces she'd seen in tiebacks of press releases, moved like islands she'd never visit. She and Rachel were a single small island in a sea of other islands, and the anonymity felt delicious and subversive in a way that was harmless because she had promised herself she would be cautious. He found her by the orchids. That was how she described the first moment afterwards, the way people try to name a precise beginning in a day that felt otherwise full of indistinguishable hours. A hand found hers like a question answered. The man's voice was low, careful, and when he spoke there was a recognition in the cadence that felt like a key turned gently in a lock. He did not ask for her name. His first words were not about who he was, but about who she might be inside a night that had permission to be other than it usually was. "You look like someone who makes thoughtful promises," he said, and the words landed as if he had read the language of the room. They walked and talked and discovered a seam of humor and an easy conversational gravity that made everything at the gala feel like an aside. He listened with a kind of rapt attention that felt like a rare breath. He told her about obscure books he loved, about places he'd been that were not on travel columns. She told him about her mother and the little apartment she'd learned to make into a home. The mask was a contract of sorts, a way to meet without a full accounting, and in the space between their anonymity and the glint of light on Crystal, something formed that was both astonishing and clean. When he asked about her promises, she said, honestly, "I saved myself for someone who would make the waiting worth it." He smiled at that, not with the smirk of someone impressed, but with the seriousness of someone who understood a ledger being balanced. At some point they danced. There was a long silence between them that was brimming rather than empty. In the moment the orchestra swelled, they leaned into a kiss that was everything she'd waited for and nothing of what she feared. It was respectful, slow, consensual, a union of curiosity and tenderness. Afterwards, they walked away from the lobby together into a cab that smelled faintly of lemon and the night, and the city's light made everything feel sudden and possible. When he asked where she lived, she said, she'll tell him tomorrow. And when he asked if she trusted him, she found, to her own surprise, that the word came easily. For tonight, she said. Consent was never ambiguous between them. There were no coercive moves, no blurred boundaries. He matched her pace, took care in the way he pulled away at times to make sure she was breathing, made space to ask if she wanted more.
It was an encounter built on mutual curiosity and gentle courage, the kind of thing that can happen when two adults, alone in the mercy of a night that allows them to be other than themselves, choose the same thing at the same time. She left the next morning when dawn made the city feel single and plain. She left a folded note under a flower vase, a trivial, intimate thing that felt like something two consenting people might do if their paths were temporary crossings. She walked the block and thought of the evening like someone who had had a secret that was now hers to carry alone. She told herself the truth. It had been beautiful in a way she wanted to honor, and she did not imagine it would ripple beyond the personal joy she had taken into the corners of her chest. Then she read the email that undid the small world she'd created. The subject line was corporate and indifferent. Memo, Pierce Industries, Strategic Alliance Announcement. The body of the memo was a diplomatic arrangement of names and interests, and at the bottom there was a photograph attached of Jackson with Diana Ashford, her face bright and practiced, his hand resting at the small of her back in a posture the cameras declared tender. The caption said simply, Engagement Announcement, Jackson Pierce and Diana Ashford. For reasons that had nothing to do with boardrooms and everything to do with biology and small honesty, Emily felt the world tilt. She could have read those signs and retreated into discretion. She could have told herself that the night had been just that, a night. But there is a particular kind of dissonance when the man who was both warm in the dark and formal in the headlines is your employer. When she walked into the office, the look that passed between Susan and the assistant in legal was not curiosity but a kind of soft alarm. "Did you see?" Susan whispered in the kitchenette where the coffee smelled like burnt rain. Emily nodded before she had meaningfully processed anything. She was still raw, a paper cut on the hinge of her jaw where a smile had been the night before. A call came from Rachel, whose voice obliged her to translate panic into pragmatism.
You have to be careful, Rachel said. There are rules here, Em. Pierce Industries has clear policies about relationships. Emily could have quoted the policy to Rachel verbatim. She'd read it when she started, the bit that said consensual personal relationships with immediate supervisors were discouraged, that disclosure was required in the case of any romantic involvement, that the company reserved the right to reassign or to take disciplinary action when power dynamics could be compromised. She'd filed it away the way one files away instructions for a device one hopes never to need. Written policy was a pale thing against the glow of human nights.
She did not imagine, when she sat across from the coffee machine and the hum of the office gathered like a distant tide, that the man in the attached photo would be the same man from the orchids. She did not expect to walk into a boardroom later that afternoon and find his presence making the air seem magnetic and dangerous all at once. Jackson Pierce existed in a public calculus she was not prepared to re-enter. At the office, he was all careful efficiency. He moved through meetings like someone walking through a life he'd trained for since he was a young man who'd learned that control was a method for survival. He had a voice that commanded without needing to shout, a precision that made people feel either small or safe. Both reactions meant the same for him. Others aligned themselves around the gravity of his decisions. For those within his orbit, that gravity felt at once protective and impossible. When he scheduled a briefing with Emily, she polished her notes the way sailors knot rope before a storm. She wrote the date at the top of the page on purpose, like a declaration. When she entered his office, with the glass hushing the rest of the world, he looked up with the kind of expression he'd never given her in a meeting before. Not the executive's raptor focus, but something slightly startled, like a man who'd been found thinking about something he shouldn't while everyone was looking. "Good morning," he said, and for a long second they only saw each other in person. No mask, no stranger's anonymity, just eyes that had somewhere to go and a life of obligations to meet. Emily was civil. She briefed him on his morning, she corrected a date, she gave him the calm that was part of her job, the ability to make chaos readable. He listened, doing that improbable thing excellent leaders do. He listened and absorbed and asked the questions that made the trouble fall into neat compartments. There was nothing of the night in that room's neon light, or if there was, it was a thin ghost. They were professional people in a professional space, and the desk between them was a courtship of agendas. She left the meeting with a pile of new tasks and a stomach full of unasked questions. Her mind kept returning to the way his hands had felt, steady, adult, careful. She kept thinking of how the world had rearranged itself when she'd seen his face in the morning light of another life, when a private night had become a public fact, not through any newspaper announcement, but simply because of the truth of his presence at the office. At home that night, she read and reread the note she'd left on the vase. It was mercifully short. Tonight felt like a small theft of time. Thank you. Her handwriting seemed foreign. The note had been a vessel for the thing she'd hoped was transitory. Now it felt like an artifact of entanglement. She had options. She had her rules. She had the policy sheet in a folder somewhere.
She could do nothing at all and keep the secret tucked like a glove in her pocket. She could tell Jackson, ask him to own the consequences. She could tell no one and let the truth remain an unanchored thing that might sink or swim as it pleased. She also had to confront the ethical architecture of what a relationship between a boss and an assistant would mean. When two people share power in such a lopsided way, the moral obligation is heavier on the person with the greater leverage. Emily had read essays about corporate ethics and conflict of interest, not to be alarmist, but because she liked the language of structure. She knew, with adult clarity, that any entanglement could erode more than promises. Careers could shift, reputations could wobble, and a private night could be weaponized by people who had interests to protect. She did not want to be an addendum to someone else's strategic life. She wanted to keep the integrity of her choice. She wanted agency to be the currency of her future decisions. Yet her heart, that stubborn, old-timey organ that did not consult policy, had a way of misbehaving. It kept replaying the way his breath had read her pauses and the specific tilt of his head when he listened. She wondered if saving herself had been about denial or about a sacred prioritizing of the person she would become when she let herself be known. Her friend Thomas found this riveting in the way people find other people's teacups intriguing. Thomas, a junior counsel with a conscience and a pleasant lack of tact, was the kind of man who would give the sort of counsel that was 1 part legal and 9 parts human. They met in a little cafe that smelled of roasted almonds, a place where the chairs were an insult to ergonomics and the espresso had serious opinions about itself. "You're turning this over in your head too much," Thomas said, his hands busy around a ceramic mug. "If the man in question is Jackson Pierce, and say he's engaged, then we're in the kind of mess that could rewrite 2 careers." "I didn't know until this morning," Emily said, "and I didn't think it would mean anything in the morning." "Of course,
But the company will look at optics, the board will look at liabilities. People are good at turning legitimate private matters into scandals because scandals are a sort of sport. He looked at her directly, the kind of person who believes bluntness is a favor. You could disclose Emily, you could ask him to disclose, or you could make a choice, leave, protect yourself. Entry and exit points matter. Her chest tightened at the word protect. She had sworn to a different kind of protection, one that involved patrimony of soul more than the shield of a job. But she understood, intellectual about it even as it hurt, that the company's strategic interests might not align with her own moral code, and that staying put could expose her to risks she did not want.
She was not certain how she felt about asking for public accountability in a situation where she felt private enough to have closed her eyes at night. The option to leave became a thought that arrived like a polite suitor, proposing and asking for a response she was not immediately willing to give. The week that followed held a new texture. People at work were ordinary consumers of gossip. They invented 1,000 narratives that had nothing necessarily to do with reality. There were rushed administrative emails about scheduling and a sudden increase in media presence around the office. In the back of Emily's mind, a shutter had come down. She worked with more precision than she had before, cataloging truth like evidence she might need later. Then a rumor slid into the office staircase like a silent guest. An announcement was scheduled for Friday. Speculation, in the social land of corporate PR, was more harmful than an actual fact, yet the office hummed with it anyway. Emily tried to keep the world at a reasonable distance. She tried to honor her own private wound in a way that did not make her spectacle fodder. It was hard to walk through an environment that was a living room for other people's expectations and not think about the shape of consequences. On Thursday night, Rachel called and said quietly, "You have to make a decision about what you want to do." "If do what?" Emily asked. "About being honest, about your place, about not letting something that was true be turned into a weapon." Rachel had a way of matter-of-factness that could be literal as a surgeon's scalpel. "And if it comes down to reputation, which you care about, make sure you protect who you are in the middle of whatever happens." Emily listened and felt the air move in the small space where she kept her decisions. She knew in the marrow that the night she had kept to herself might be a small betrayal of her own public life if it hurt the very things she valued. But she also knew that the person who had stolen her heart under a mask had been gentle and consenting and had offered no claim. The intimacy had been two adults choosing something tender. Was that wrong because the world wore a different face? On the morning of the announcement, the lobby felt different. There was an unease that made coffee cups tilt like compasses searching for true north. When the press release went live, it was a polished thing, a photograph, a statement about mutual commitment, a line about shared values and future endeavors. Diana Ashford and Jackson Pierce would join their companies through both marriage and merger. The language was intentional, two families aligning for mutual expansion, a symbolic unity to calm investors and give a tidy narrative that could be put on slides. Emily read the release at her desk before anyone else had the kindness to tell her the news in person. Her hands were steady, though her heart would not be. A new interior rule had arrived without her consent. The person she'd spent a night with would now be besieged by duties that required him to behave in ways that were aligned with commerce. To be claimed in the language of a press release was different from being chosen in the whisper of midnight. She felt the two worlds colliding, private and public, and the collision gave off sparks that burned at the skin. That afternoon, he asked for another meeting. When he closed the glass door behind them, the city outside seemed far away. His face was not the one from the announcement. It was the more complicated face she had seen the night he removed his mask, a man who carried both desire and an impossible set of obligations. The tilt of his jaw, the weight behind his eyes, he looked tired, or perhaps the look was one she had not given him permission to see. "We need to talk," he said. His voice had the quiet urgency of someone who knew what protocol would demand and did not want to meet it without first doing right by the person across from him. He was careful about his words. He did not coerce. He did not ask anything of her that would diminish her agency. He told her, without fanfare, that the announcement had been planned and that the ramifications were more complex than she could imagine. He told her that he had been wrong to conceal, that he had not expected the night to become the kind of thing that would interfere with his duties. He said he was disposed to take responsibility for whatever consequences followed. He referred to the policy and to the board, and to the fact that being engaged to someone like Diana Ashford was less a personal arrangement and more a strategic move that had been months in motion. Emily listened and felt the axis of her life shift in a way that was both gentle and terrifying. He apologized for the confusion, for the poor timing, for the fact that he had not thought about the power dynamic in the way she would have hoped. He gave her space to decide what she needed. He said, earnestly,
that he would accept whatever consequence the board imposed if he had to, and that he did not want her to be hurt by him. Those words were both a bomb and a grenade. The idea that the person with the power had acknowledged it and was willing to shoulder fallout felt like a promise, but it also underlined a sheer functioning asymmetry they faced. You could ask him to disclose, Thomas had said, and in that moment Jackson's deference felt like a first step. Yet what he proposed would not end the story. It would force the beginning of a new public chapter. Disclosure required consent and timing and a bravery neither of them had been prepared to offer in neat packages. Emily could have let him take the blow. She could have kept their secret and let him decide how to manage the narrative because he was the person with influence and reach. But that would have been to trade one kind of betrayal for another, the betrayal of her own autonomy.
She would not be an accessory to a story that erased her choice. So she did what felt both radical and inevitable. She picked up a pen, opened a document, and drafted her resignation. The resignation was clinical but tender in the way she wrote it. She thanked the company for the opportunities, for the mentoring and the access she had been given. She did not write blame. She did not write accusation. She wrote a statement about wanting to protect the integrity of the work she loved and about not allowing a private mistake of judgment to become a liability to the team. It was the kind of letter that would look measured in a file, principled and clear. It was also a letter that, upon signing, felt like fire on her tongue, a thing she would have to swallow and live with. "You don't have to leave," Jackson said in their next meeting. Having read, he admitted, that she had prepared the letter. He set his cup down with an unnecessary slowness. "We can handle this. I will disclose. I'll tell the board. I'll tell the press if you want me to. We'll manage the optics. I will make sure there are no reprisals. I will accept responsibility." Emily heard it and felt 1,000 tiny animals move in her chest. Her life, she had believed, belonged to her. The idea of allowing another to reshape it, even with the noblest intentions, felt wrong. At the same time, his words opened a corridor she could not easily ignore. A man of power offering to sacrifice it for her was a kind of love language that required interpretation. Was he trying to save her reputation or himself? Was he trying to own the moment because it would finally make him free? "I can't be asked to make that decision for you," he said, softer, and there was honesty in the shape of the sentence. "I can't ask you to trust me publicly. I can only offer what I can do. I'm willing to step back. I'm willing to be accountable." When she handed in the letter the next day, Susan's face was a map of concern and admiration. "Are you sure?" Susan asked. "You're very valuable here." "I know what I'm doing," Emily said, which was partly true and partly a defense. She felt raw, unmoored, as if she'd cut a string and had not yet learned how to hold the object that fell free. She wanted to leave with dignity, not to be escorted out with whispers. She wanted to be the author of her own unmaking. Leaving the office felt like stepping through a membrane. The outside air was sharp and honest. She thought of the promise she had made about saving herself. She thought of the man whose unmasked face had been both the beginning and the complication of the story. There was no simple villain here. There was only the entanglement of two consenting hearts in a world that had, for long-standing reasons, made such entanglements combustible. She did not yet know the full cost of the choices she was making. She did not yet know about all the people who would judge, or the friends who would counsel, or the legal calculations that would roll like distant thunder in rooms she had never entered. She did not yet know, and perhaps that ignorance was merciful for a moment, a grace that allowed her to preserve the edges of herself before they were buffed down by other forces. That evening, she sat on the fire escape of her small apartment and watched the city breathe. Her phone vibrated, a message from Rachel with a string of hearts, a message from Thomas with a text that began with, "Be careful." There was also a draft of her resignation in her outbox, and a hollow in her sternum that felt like the start of a bruise. She thought of the mask in her drawer and the way the man had said, simply, "For tonight." She thought of his hands and the careful way he had kept pace. She thought of how life sometimes asks you to choose between staying put and moving to protect what you have chosen. Her fingers closed around the edge of the fire escape until they ached, and she breathed. At home, the vase with the note she'd left on the bedside table looked different. The note had been intended as a small elegy to secrecy. Now it felt like an accusation from the past. She touched the paper with the back of her hand, as if it were someone alive and breathing. Then, with the strange geometric clarity that comes after a long internal debate,
She decided she would not be the kind of person who had their life rearranged without consent. She sent the resignation and hit save. She did not yet hand it to human resources in person. She wanted the separation to be deliberate, not a hasty fleeing. She planned a weekend away to think. She told no one, except Rachel and Thomas in small, coded phrases. She allowed herself to be a woman who kept her own counsel. That night she dreamed of masks. They floated above a field like clouds, each one a possibility. In the dream, she could remove them at will and give them to the people she loved, or she could keep them, and that was a choice that belonged solely to her. When she woke up, the world felt like a ledger that had not yet balanced. She had saved herself up to this point. Now she would make the choice about what saving meant. There was no grand gesture at the end of the week, no dramatic reconciliation, no courtroom drama, no cinematic car chase. The world moved with its usual merciless efficiency. Jackson convened meetings, PR teams rehearsed statements. Diana Ashford's name continued to arc across headlines with a practiced brightness. But in the quiet rooms she frequented, the kitchen where the kettle sang, the park bench where the air smelled of damp leaves, Emily made a series of small decisions that would, in time, define the life she wanted to build. Her resignation landed in HR with the formalities it demanded.
A manager accepted it with the kind of slide of protocol that made grief look like a spreadsheet. Signatures, counter-signatures, the efficient transfer of tasks. It was done. She felt simultaneously liberated and bereft. She had saved herself, she thought, and yet the act of saving had not been a simple preservation of a thing. It had been an active choosing, step by step. For now, she would leave, not because running was the only option, but because leaving let her own voice have the last word. She told herself she would not yield to pressure to be claimed by default. If she were claimed, it would be because she chose it, because the person claiming her accepted not the power dynamics, but the responsibility and the consequence that would come with it. She packed a small bag. She left a note for her mother that said nothing of drama and everything of pragmatic reassurance. Margaret Morrison, who was both sturdy and sentimental, would understand the kind of lesson here, one about boundaries, about the dignity of choice. Emily wanted, beneath the surface of everything, for her decision to be her own kind of grace. As she closed the door behind her, she did not yet know the full shape of what came next. She did not know which headlines would name her, which friends would whisper, and which would stand with her. She did not know that there were still more choices waiting, that morning revelations could contain deeper consequences than she could foresee. She sat on the train with her hand wrapped around a paper cup of coffee, watching the city peel away into neighborhoods and then into a less assertive hum. The cup warmed her palm and grounded her. She looked at the skyline one last time and repeated the old line she had kept in a notebook as if it were a prayer. I will give myself only to someone who makes the waiting worth it. Some promises are foundations, others are tests. Emily had set the terms for herself, and in the quiet throb of the moment she chose to step away, she was both keeping and testing that vow. If you love slow-burn love stories and the kind of messy, earnest choices that make a heart feel alive, subscribe for the full tale. She did not yet know the name of the life that would follow, not the headlines, not the boardroom calculations, not even the next morning's small and decisive truths. But she felt with a clear, cold certainty that this story was not finished. The night had been a confession. The day had demanded reckoning. The question now was what kind of reckoning she would allow, and who, if anyone, would be willing to stand in the light with her when it was time to be seen for more than the careful promise she had carried into a mask and a night. The weekend did not fix anything the way Emily had hoped. It offered only distance, an unglamorous, necessary separation from a life that felt suddenly over-illuminated. She stayed at her mother's apartment for 3 days, sleeping in the room she had occupied as a child, letting the familiar curtains and the smell of lavender make sense of a heart that still felt raw. Margaret made soup that tasted like instructions for living, and she listened without asking for details. There was mercy in her silence. On the 4th morning, with sunlight like a thin coin slipping through the blinds, Emily sat across from Rachel at a diner where the booths were tufted and the coffee was honest. Rachel had come to be a kind of weather system, blunt wind, then shelter. You have to take care of yourself, Rachel said, stirring sugar until the spoon made a small sound. And you need to know you don't owe anyone an explanation for your privacy, but you also get to name the terms. Emily nodded, grateful for the clarity and frightened by it. In the back of her mind, something small had been rearranging. Her appetite felt odd.
her nights threaded with an exhaustion that went deeper than leaving a staff meeting too late. For a week, she told herself it was stress. On a whim, or perhaps because her mind needed a concrete thing to hold, she bought a test in a little pharmacy under the awning of a street that smelled like fried dough and rain. The clerk wrapped it with a practiced neutrality. She paid in cash like someone not wanting paper trails. At home that night, in the tiny, private light of her kitchen, Emily followed the instructions with the meticulousness she used at work. There was a stillness to the minutes a test required, a quiet that in other circumstances could have been called anticipation. When the line appeared, faint and steady as a breath, she sat down on the floor and felt the world tilt in a way that was at once terrifying and, in its own odd geometry, inevitable. She was pregnant. The knowledge arrived without melody. There was no cinematic sunrise, no sense that fate had laid a red carpet. There was only the practical pulse of reality, a small answer to a question she hadn't meant to ask, and the sudden acute responsibility that comes with knowing. For a long time she did nothing. She inhaled and exhaled the way one does when testing the strength of a limb after a fall. Then she called Thomas, because logic felt like an anchor, and he had been generous with the language of counsel. His voice on the line was precise and kind. "We'll make a plan," he said, in that way he had of lowering the volume of panic. "We'll consider options and consequences. You choose. I'll support whatever you decide." She told Rachel, whose first reaction was an intake of breath, and then, fiercely, "We are not letting anyone weaponize this." Rachel's anger felt like a promise. It made Emily feel less alone. The first person she wanted to tell, if she could choose who to tell, was Jackson.
The idea of a press conference where she would be reduced to a headline repulsed her. The idea of telling him in the privacy of a room, with the possibility of an adult conversation where they both accepted the responsibility their choices had produced, felt like the right form of justice. It was not about romantic notions. It was about truth and agency. She did not call him immediately. She needed a plan about how to hold herself. She arranged an appointment with a doctor, got a scan scheduled, and let the small, precise staff at the clinic do the work of translating biology into a picture on a screen. The fetal heartbeat, tiny and insistent, had an effect so sharp Emily had to sit down on the vinyl chair in the dim exam room to study herself. Tears came without the sound of melodrama. They came like a reaction to a chemical in the air that made the world rearrange its priorities. She wrote the message to Jackson 3 times, and then rewrote it. She kept the tone economical and honest. She was pregnant, she wanted to know how he planned to proceed, and she asked for a conversation face to face. She sent it with her thumb, and waited, which felt like a classroom sentence in patience. He replied within hours. He asked for the same courtesy, a private meeting. He was direct and respectful in a way that made the boardroom's polish feel like a thin coin, a surface that hid a different temperature beneath. He suggested that they meet at his office because it was neutral, and he said softly, because there were things only possible in a space where difficult conversations could be fully attended to. The meeting could have been a checklist: confirm dates, discuss options, decide between public disclosure or private negotiation. It became instead an honest, unflinching reckoning. When Emily arrived, she felt the old chambered calm of the floor dissolve into something else. Jackson stood by the window as if the skyline offered him counsel. He looked smaller than he did in photographs, like someone reframed by a private pain. He welcomed her without ceremony and motioned to the chair opposite his. She laid the report and the printed scan on his desk. He looked first at the image, then at her. There was a stillness like a held breath. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. He closed his eyes for a second and then opened them as if someone had explained a geometry he had been avoiding. "Thank you for telling me," he replied. His voice managed to be both shocked and steady. He stopped. He exhaled, then began again. "I don't have the right words. I want to be accountable, Emily. Not for headlines, not for damage control. Accountable to you." She watched his hands. He had a habit she'd noticed before, of taking off his watch in moments of private reckoning, as if removing the device might pause time. Tonight, he left the watch on. "We need to make decisions," she said, "together, but on my terms." "Agreed," he answered quickly, then softer. "What are your terms?" Emily said, measured and resolute, I've saved myself because I wanted to enter something alive and chosen, not as an accident in someone's schedule of alliances. If we are to proceed in any way that involves the child, I need transparency. I need you to end your engagement with Diana. I need you to accept professional consequences, at least the steps it takes to remove direct supervisory dynamics so that whatever happens between us is free of that imbalance. I need a public acknowledgement that I'm not an accessory to a strategic move. And I want a proper courtship, time to decide how we become together. He did not flinch. He listened in the way she'd learned to recognize, fully, with his whole posture agreeing to the gravity of the sentence. I will do those things, he said. I will end the engagement. I will work with the board to recuse myself from any immediate conflicts. I will be accountable. And I will court you properly. I won't ask for an answer today, only the chance to act as you've asked. The admission could have been a trap, an offer designed to smooth the path for him and for the company, but the look on his face argued for a deeper truth. He looked as though he carried the cost of decision already in his chest. Emily tested for coercion or convenience, and found, in that room, nothing of either. This was not a rescue from him. It was an offer to be together under the conditions she required. She told him she would not sign anything under pressure, that any public acknowledgement would be carefully timed, and that she would not be moved by platitudes. She demanded one more thing, that he meet her mother before any announcement, to show that this choice would be anchored in real human relationships and not just in corporate dramaturgy. Jackson agreed. He made the first move that would ripple outward. He canceled a dinner with Diana and asked for a meeting with the board. Word traveled as it does, quiet at first, then like steam. Jackson walked into a boardroom and, with an economy that surprised people who had known him for years, presented his decision. He told the board, in plain language, that his private life had produced complications that could not be ignored, and that he intended to end his engagement and take steps to reduce conflicts of interest. He presented a plan in which he would temporarily delegate control of certain negotiations, including the Ashford merger talks, to trusted executives and place certain actions on hold while matters of governance were clarified. There was immediate resistance. Board members whose calculus often used marriage as a strategic asset bristled. Richard Ashford, whose name carried the weight of an empire, and whose daughter's engagement had been advertised as a unifying signal, was not a man to be moved lightly. He called Jackson a week later, and the tone of the conversation was cool and procedural. Jackson told the board he would accept whatever consequence was necessary, even if it cost him his position. That admission shocked them. In many places, power was conserved before personal honor. In others, like Jackson's single-minded world, honor could require sacrifice. Emily watched the fallout like someone watching her own reflection in a shifting pool. The press smelled blood. There were photographs, there were live shots outside Jackson's building, where reporters speculated about the reasons behind the sudden halt of the merger. Diana's name appeared everywhere, with a brightness that suggested she would not disappear quietly. Rumors of settlements and negotiations bloomed like fungus in the absence of clarity. Through it all, Emily insisted on shape and boundaries. She met Jackson's mother and then, at his insistence, introduced him to Margaret in a living room lit by lamps that smelled of lemon and old books. The first meeting was awkward in a way that felt human, two families sizing up the edges of a life they had not anticipated. Margaret asked practical questions with the blunt tenderness only a parent can conjure. She wanted to know how Jackson would support Emily emotionally and financially, not because she sought numbers, but because she wanted reassurance that Emily's dignity would be protected. Jackson listened and answered. He spoke of stepping back from daily leadership tasks to focus on righting what his choices had undone. He promised to make the children's needs central in any decision he made. There was a humility in that promise that unsettled the men who had made careers out of certainty. If there was a public moment that hammered the private into shape, it was the press conference Jackson called 3 weeks after Emily's scan. He stood before cameras with Emily at his side, a deliberate act that refused the soft privacy the gossip columns preferred. He thanked the public for their interest, and then, without platitude, said he had ended his engagement to Diana Ashford. He acknowledged the personal nature of the matter, but stressed that truth and responsibility required him to be transparent. He spoke of his gratitude to the people who had worked with him, and of his intention to step back from certain active negotiations while governance questions were addressed. For Emily, standing beside him felt like stepping into a room with glass walls. There were murmurs and flashes and the old animal of anxiety,
But there was also a strange steadiness. She watched him answer questions, and she watched their hands brush, intentionally, as a private reassurance. He had chosen to make the mess his by acknowledging it publicly. It was a risky moral architecture, and not everyone respected it. Editorials called it quixotic. Some board members muttered about imprudence. But the world cannot always reduce a human decision to a neat headline. And for all its mess, there was something brave in Jackson's choice.
There were private consequences to meet. Richard Ashford, who had expected a tidy merge and a daughter happily married into stability, moved in ways that were both legal and social. Diana, hurt and articulate, negotiated with a dignity that made newspaper readers feel ashamed for their schadenfreude. There were conversations that required delicacy and compensations the company would accept to avoid more damaging ruptures. These things were not solved in a day. They were unraveled in negotiations that had the slow tension of a pulled seam being restitched. Through the bureaucratic fog, Jackson did the work that mattered to Emily's sense of moral order. He made good on his offers. He recused himself from certain calls. He rearranged his calendar so that his dealings with Pierce Industries were less about direct bargaining and more about long-term stewardship. And he accepted public accountability in a way that made board members, stolid and pragmatic, recognize he had placed something other than profit at the center of his decision. Emily insisted on her own agency in this period. She did not wish to be paraded or to have decisions made on her behalf. She met with lawyers and counselors, not to be coddled, but to name terms, how she wanted the child's privacy preserved, what financial independence she required, what kind of involvement she wanted from Jackson in terms of courtship rather than corporate convenience. Slowly, awkwardly, they designed parameters that protected her and gave Jackson a roadmap for how to choose her without erasing the realities of his position. Their courtship was deliberate because both knew that a rushed acquiescence could be an erasure. They dated as best they could in the public eye. Lunches in quiet restaurants where they spoke of books and of the absurdity of being photographed while ordering coffee. Walks in early mornings when the city was generous with space. Nights where the decision to be tender was practiced like a new language. It was during one of these gently choreographed evenings that Jackson went to Emily's apartment with an arrangement of wildflowers and a ring he had chosen with the unshowy severity of a man learning to love with intention. They did not announce an engagement in the sensational way tabloids might have desired. Jackson proposed in a room lit with lamps and honesty. He did not ask her to forgive the social consequences at once. He asked her to consider being with him when they could both meet the price. "I want to get this right," he said, voice steady. "I want to be accountable in ways that matter to you. I want our life to be chosen, not a default or a rescue. Will you let me make the right choices from here on?" Emily took time to answer. She asked about practicalities. How would he safeguard the child from the chop of public exposure? How would they manage his role at the company so her career would not be reduced to a footnote? She asked for a real courtship. No abrupt wedding, no being claimed by a headline. She asked him to meet her family fully and to make reparations where necessary. He agreed to each condition, and then some. He offered a binding clause for transparency, a public commitment to remove himself from the core merger decisions, and, most importantly in her mind, the promise to make decisions with her, not for her. She said yes, because after months of wrestling and negotiating and tiny acts of tenderness, the choice felt voluntary and luminous. It was not an easy yes. It was chosen and considered and consistent with the vow she had always kept. She had saved herself not to be hoarded, but to ensure the person she gave herself to would be willing to accept the work of love. The weeks that followed involved logistical realities that made headlines feel petty. There were announcements, formal and deliberate. The company released statements that spoke of restructuring and governance reviews. Richard Ashford accepted the dissolution of the engagement with the kind of dignity that grew from social training, and Diana, wounded but unbowed, moved on in a way that later settled into a friendship of Emily, born of frank adult conversations. The world, which likes narratives tidy and decisive, began to reassign its attention in small degrees. When the wedding came, it was not a ball, but a gathering. Family, a few close friends, Margaret in a dress with sleeves, Rachel in dramatic shoes, Thomas with that expression he always wore when he suspected a verdict he liked. Jackson's hand shook once at the altar, because something as simple and as terrifying as commitment can make a man who is used to controlling numbers feel oddly unmoored. He said his vows with an honesty that left no room for spectacle. Emily said hers with the reserve of someone who knew the gravity of words and would not let them be cheapened.
They did not announce everything to the press. They made choices about what to share publicly and what to keep for their private life. Grace, born 9 months later in a quiet hospital room smelling of lemon and antiseptic and the improbable hope that human beings sometimes call love, entered the world like a gentle verdict. When Emily held her daughter for the first time, she felt the kind of exhaustion that made her bones honest. She felt, too, a joy that had nothing to do with headlines and everything to do with the small heartbeat echoing against her chest. They named her Grace, because Emily wanted the name to be both a quiet defiance and a benediction, a promise that the child she had chosen to bring into the world would know she had been wanted, not merely absorbed into a public narrative. Grace's arrival reframed everything. It was not a solution to difficulties, but a living, sweet responsibility that made their choices more meaningful. Life after the birth was the real work.
There were nights when Emily watched Jackson assemble pacifiers with the concentration of a man used to corporate charts. There were mornings when he would carry Grace against his chest, and both would stand in the window watching the city make sense of itself. There were conversations with the board about longer-term governance changes, about how a public company could better manage personal entanglements without damaging careers, conversations that were tedious and necessary, bureaucratic and moral. Emily returned to work months later. Not to the same position, there had been adjustments and a realignment of her responsibilities, but to a role that honored her competence and allowed her the dignity of professional life. They had to learn about boundaries continually. Jackson, who had been a CEO in a world where outcomes mattered and feelings were risks, relearned how to speak in domestic terms, how to apologize without strategizing, how to be present when exhaustion made everything a bit rougher. Emily, who had saved herself in a way that many called old-fashioned, learned to be flexible, to accept help, and to let the life she had vowed to protect be complicated by the very people she loved. Not all of their allies were constant. Some friendships thinned under the strain of attention, gossip resurfaced occasionally, and there were ugly headlines that tried to reduce Emily to a lever Jackson had pulled. Those moments hurt, but they also clarified where loyalty lived. Susan called often and brought pies. Thomas visited and made small legal jokes that made Emily laugh. Rachel, ever fierce, sat with Emily on nights when the world felt loud and helped her remember the woman who had written the rule in the first place. Years later, there were quieter rooms where Grace would practice lifting blocks and knock them down with the polite fury of a small jog well done. There were evenings when Emily and Jackson would sit on the sofa and not speak, simply savoring the fact of a domestic peace that had cost them both something to attain. They would sometimes go back to the terrace where Jackson had once tried to frame a decision in the thin air of glass and sky. On those nights, they watched the city, and Emily would press her hand to Jackson's and remember the vow that had started everything, not as an old talisman, but as a compass that had helped her navigate a complicated, imperfect life. The story's resolution did not arrive as a single grand proof, but as a series of small, consistent truths. Jackson's consistent accountability at work, Emily's return to a career that acknowledged her brain and her choices, their partnership in parenting that meant decisions were shared, and the way Grace's laugh became the most convincing argument that their choice had been right for them. Emily never regretted the promise she had made to herself. It had not been a sword that cut off possibility, but a standard that required interpretation and courage.
She had given herself because the man who asked to claim her had been willing to live with the consequence of that claim. He had taken responsibility in ways that mattered, publicly and privately, and she had allowed herself to be claimed because she had not been coerced, because she had set terms, and because he had met them. On a late afternoon, years after the first masquerade, Emily sat at the window of the small kitchen they shared and watched Grace chase sunlight across a rug. Jackson was at his laptop, working on something corporate and mundane. Occasionally, he would look up, and their eyes would meet with the calm punctuation of long partnership. Margaret was on the phone, telling a story about the time Emily had insisted a child learn to ride a bike without help, and Rachel was somewhere rehearsing a speech about courage, which was perfectly in her wheelhouse. Emily found she could think about the past without the acute sting that had once accompanied it. The night at the gala had been a turning point, yes, but not a destiny written in someone else's ink. It was an event that required response, and the response had been slow work: confession, accountability, negotiations, and then the labor of living with authenticity. She had saved herself for someone who would make the waiting worth it. In the end, she had been claimed not as property, but as a partner eagerly chosen. The claiming had required cost and humility and public reckoning. It required Jackson to choose differently than his past and to accept the consequences of that choice.
Emily had not been stolen away by force or glamour. She had been invited, properly invited, into a life that asked for her whole self. When Grace fell asleep in Emily's arms, the little breathes like a small wave, Emily mused how the word grace lived in more than one register. It was a name, a free gift, the quality of being given something not strictly earned. It was also, she thought, the slow, patient economy of human beings making choices that honored one another. She had saved herself not to keep love at bay, but to make it a thing that would be willingly built, piece by piece. If this story has touched you, if you love careful romances that choose responsibility and tenderness, like and subscribe for more full-length stories. Tell us in the comments which moment surprised you most. Was it the masquerade, the confession, or the way they built a life after the headlines?